Hi, I'm Howard Silver. For 25 years, I led an organization called the Consortium of Social Science Associations that advocated for federal funding for social and behavioral science research, the kind of research used often by journalists in their many stories about society and its politics. Although I am mostly retired now, which is nice, I do write a monthly column for something called socialsciencespace.com. I am also a frequent attendee of events here at 6th and I, and a supporter of the organization's wide-ranging cultural, spiritual, and arts program. I'm also a subscriber to the Atlantic. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. The program this evening is the latest installment in an ongoing partnership between the Atlantic and 6th and I, which brings the Atlantic's journalism to life through conversations with its leading editorial voices. With an emphasis on exploring the ideas and topics most relevant to our lives, the series has featured a diverse range of authors and thinkers, including Ta-Nehisi Coates, Anne-Marie Slaughter, and most recently, David Frum. In 1911, a writer named Norman Angell said nationalism is more important than life itself, something the world was to learn 3 years later. Now, nationalism has taken on a new voice in American politics, and it's shifting the cultural and political landscape in countries across the world. The Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg, national correspondent Graeme Wood, and White House correspondent Rosie Gray have been charting this growing phenomenon in different regions. Tonight, they'll discuss the future of nationalism in the era of President Trump, and they will also dive into Graeme Wood's remarkable recent piece in the June issue of The Atlantic, his Kampf, about Richard Spencer, the leader of the AltRight movement, who also happens to be Wood's high school classmate. The reaction to that issue of the magazine has been tremendous, propelling The Atlantic to a new monthly audience record of 42.3 million visitors. Toward the end of the program, you're encouraged to join the conversation by asking questions of tonight's esteemed panel, and there are microphones in the front of the auditorium to facilitate that interaction. Tonight's event is being streamed live on Facebook.com/The Atlantic. So if you know anyone who couldn't come, please tell them that they can still tune in online. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to The Atlantic for being such a fantastic partner for 6th and I. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Goldberg, Graeme Wood, and Rosie Gray.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening. And thank you for coming to this one in a continuing series that we're doing with 6th and I. 6th and I is one of our best partners, and I'm very appreciative to everybody who works with us here. We're going to jump right into this conversation, but just give me a show of hands. How many people here are in the alt-right currently? Just checking. Just want to check. We're going to find out, I guess, in the course of this, if there is anyone here from the alt-right. Let me start with some definitions, and I'll ask both of you to do this. Maybe Graeme, we'll start with you, because you've studied the ideology here. What is the alt-right? Are we correct to call it the alt-right? And what, if anything, makes the alt-right different from the neo-Nazis and skinheads that I covered in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who, when they hear the alt-right, it's the term that the alt-right calls itself, and there's obviously going to be some resistance to using a nomenclature that a kind of reprehensible movement likes. It also happens to be accurate. They consider themselves a version of the right that was rejected by most of the right. There's a political philosopher named Paul Gottfried, who's probably the guy who first coined it as and alternative right. And then Richard Spencer, off in the woods in Montana, started a magazine called AlternativeRight.com. And I think it just kind of got turned into something hip. It got shortened, as these things do, to alt-right. And now it stands for...
Do you object to using it?
I think it's, first of all, like I say, it's accurate. And I think it's important to understand the origins of it as a rejection of a kind of right that we would have recognized from earlier in this millennium.
Right.
So I think it's okay to use. Now, there are ways in which it is simply reviving forms of racism and nationalism that we saw earlier and putting a prettier face on it. So I think when we use it, we do have to be honest about about its roots.
Right. So talk a little bit, and then I'll go to Rosie on this, but talk a little bit about what differentiates alt-right ideology from what we would think of as classical National Socialism ideology or classic fascist ideology.
Yeah, I mean, one objection that I have to using neo-Nazi as a word to describe, say, the ideology of Richard Spencer is that it sort of emphasizes the neo a little bit too much. There's not that much that differentiates it, and there's many things that
it should be like called classic Nazi. Like,
yeah,
not new Nazi. Yeah.
Right. So, what differentiates it from other forms of right, though? The alt-right, especially Paul Gottfried, they were very, they felt very aggrieved at being rejected by especially neoconservatives,
right.
and forms of the right that looked upon them as a bunch of racists. And they said, no, we're not. We just have some views about race that are very strong, but don't emphasize that so much. So when they called themselves alternative to begin with, it was to reject versions of the right that were especially based on ideas about the free market, about America, about nationalism. And instead, in the case of Richard Spencer in particular, to say that instead it's a different type of emphasis on identity that the right has not seen for decades.
Right. Rosie, talk about, it's a question that obviously people have asked for the last several months, or a variation of a question people asked for the last several months. Steve Bannon, alt-right, nationalist, how does he define himself, and how would you differentiate what Steve Bannon and some of the people in the Breitbart cohort think with the Richard Spencer, more overtly Nazi-curious, at least, ideologues of the alt-right?
Well, if you look at Steve Bannon's past statements about what he has said about his own ideology, I mean, he's used the term economic nationalist to describe himself. There is
but
that
that's just a more aggressive term for protectionist in a kind of way. That doesn't go anywhere near the stuff that Graham is talking about.
Sure, but he definitely, I mean, I think has sort of embraced the term nationalist. In terms of alt-right, there is this one interview that he gave last summer during the campaign when he described Breitbart, which he was, I think, still running at the time, or maybe he had recently joined the Trump campaign. He described it as a platform for the alt-right. And that's really the only time that he's made sort of an overt overture in terms of himself to the alt-right movement. I mean, I think at this point, like, we're up here sort of wrestling with what alt-right really means. I don't think that I would characterize Steve Bannon as being part of the alt-right. I do think that that under his leadership and in the time since then, Breitbart has sort of shown itself to be kind of, at times, kind of alt-right curious. Mm-hmm. But I would not lump in Steve Bannon with Richard Spencer.
What do you call Steve Bannon?
I don't know what I would necessarily call Steve Bannon. I mean, a lot of these terms don't quite cut it. I would say that he's a populist. I would say that he's a nationalist. I mean, Breitbart sort of favors the term populist nationalist to describe kind of the Trumpist movement, ideology.
Right.
With Steve Bannon, we have these conversations where we're trying to pick through interviews that he gave 5 years ago and try to figure out what the ideology is behind it. And as with Trump, we might have to face the idea that there is no coherent ideology. There are definitely little snippets of conversations he's had, including with Trump himself on his sort of podcast or radio program, that are, we could say, if not alt-right curious, alt-right compliant. And that, I think, is what Richard Spencer in particular sees as a kind of entry point to politics, since he himself, I don't think he thinks he's going to be elected to any position.
Right.
But he hears Steve Bannon and others say things that would not be said by most people. Ideas about the identity of America as a culture rather than just a place. That and as a culture with a kind of exclusiveness to it.
Right. I want you to spend a couple of minutes on Richard Spencer, your former classmate, in a moment. But do one turn on this question. This is one of those moments when people who are only half paying attention over the last year said, wait a second, what's going on here? And that's the moment when Donald Trump embraced the slogan, America First. And then was told, you might not want to use that because that was the term of the Lindberghian proto-fascists of the 30s, and they said, no, it's a good expression. That's when a lot of people said, what is going on here? Do you know the story of how that came into circulation, how that slogan came in front of Donald Trump, and how he developed that? Has that been known?
I don't know if it's necessarily known exactly the genesis of it. I think it's something that he sort of happened upon and liked and kind of stuck with. I mean, this is not a president, and this was not a candidate who was, super receptive to what he would consider, sort of politically correct criticisms of his messaging.
But there's political incorrectness, and then there's Nazi slogans. Right?
Oh, yeah, sure. But I'm saying, you seem sort of like surprised that somebody told him that it was a Nazi slogan and that he stuck with it, whereas I don't necessarily.
Yeah, it is true that human beings can get used to anything, but when a leading candidate for president of the United States is told that you're using a Nazi-ish slogan and they continue to use it, that's a relatively novel experience in modern American politics.
But you see this all the time, even with Richard Spencer. A video crew from the Atlantic captured him receiving fascist salutes. And the response is always something along the lines of, oh, it was ironic, or it didn't mean what it meant when it was being done in Nazi Germany. It has some other meaning. So that there's frequently this kind of plausible or implausible deniability that they'll use to deny what seems obvious to the three of us, I think.
Right. Spend a couple of minutes talking about Richard Spencer. How you met him, how you lost touch, how you figured out that your Richard Spencer had become America's leading alt-right figure, and take us through to his place in the right-wing firmament today. That's where I want to jump off to the next question.
So the first time I met Richard, I believe, was in chemistry class when we were in grade 8th grade. He was my lab partner. We did not choose each other as lab partners. We were assigned.
Nobody would blame you for that, by the way.
I mean, I feel like I have to kind of back off as much as possible, even from my 13-year-old self's decisions or not decisions. But at that point, and all through high school, we knew each other.
Your prom date, David friends. Duke, was another story, but yeah.
Richard was a totally normal guy for North Dallas. I mean, North Dallas was a Republican-leaning kind of place, but Republican-leaning definitely does not mean alt-right. I just thought of him in a way that I now regret, of course. I felt a sort of snobbish attitude toward him as someone who was not part of my social circle, who got worse grades than I did, and who I expected once I graduated never to see again, hoped never to see again. And now I realize that he was something more than that. Within about 10 years, I encountered him here in Washington, and there was something different. I mean, the first words out of his mouth after confirming that we were the same people who were 8th grade lab partners was to ask me about politics, and then to speak about politics in a way that was, politics, pretty normal topic of conversation here in Washington, but he wanted to talk about politics in a very philosophical way. It was clear that he had really made use of his library card over the last 10 years. He had changed from the Richard Spencer, kind of a jock B student in the 1990s, to being someone who really loved the play of ideas and wanted to talk about specifically some ideas from the early 20th century in Central Europe, and thought that those ideas had new applicability now. So
We don't know, we can't look into the soul of another person, but what do you think triggered him to move down this pathway that he moved toward fascism?
the University of Chicago. Now, most people who go to the U of C and the Committee on Social Thought do not end up as Richard Spencer, but it seems like after going to Colgate and then going to UVA for his undergrad, really getting into Wagner for a while, and then going for a master's degree at the University of Chicago, where that play of ideas, that philosophical play of ideas is expected. It's a good thing. He just landed on the wrong idea when the music stopped, and that idea was a true love of a kind of authoritarianism that was defended in this intellectual sense in the early 20th century in Europe, in specifically Nazi Germany.
Right, but so pick up the narrative and take us to how he becomes the ideologue or the thought leader of this movement. One of the things that's interesting about him to me is that in my experience 20, 25 years ago covering skinheads and the like, is that a lot of those people, they weren't by any means intellectual, and I'm not calling Richard Spencer an intellectual per se, but they came to racism as an organizing principle of their lives. They came to authoritarianism out of a set of very well-developed economic-based resentments. Sort of the reason that poor whites in the 30s and 20s and 40s and 50s were drawn to the KKK rather than middle-class or upper-class whites. This is a different
Very different story.
Yeah. Go on.
Richard's, he comes from a very wealthy background. He has no grievance that I could name, except perhaps being looked down on by the A students in our high school. So, not to say I bear
Thank you very
personal
much.
responsibility, but I think for a while he realized that there was more to him than just being a B student. He had possibilities within. And I think he probably...
What's wrong with running for Congress as a Republican, though? That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, there are normal channels for this feeling,
Right.
and he did not choose them.
Continue with his development. Is it because he has this maybe greater brain power than the typical skinhead that he rose and that he developed a set of ideas that people latched onto? What's the story behind it?
You declined to call him an intellectual. I think I probably would. You know, Jacques Barzun famously said an intellectual is just a guy who carries a briefcase to work. That's an intellectual.
Right.
Today, someone who has a laptop or a Gmail account, I don't know. Right. I think with Richard, he's an intellectual in the sense that to counter his ideas, you need to do some reading. You need to go to the library. You need to do a few Wikipedia article skimmings. You know, it's not as if he's coming to these ideas purely out of opportunism. In fact, he'd probably be, I don't know, he wouldn't be more famous if he had better ideas, but he would probably have more opportunities in the future. So
Right.
it's not cynical. It's sincerely felt, and it's a kind of intellectualism.
Rosie, how popular is Richard Spencer, actually? It's a question for both of you, but one of the things I'm wondering about, and this thought is prompted by watching a fever seem to break in France. I'm wondering if we in the mainstream press, if mainstream politicians, in a general fear about the direction the country is going, have made Richard Spencer and Richard Spencer figures a little bit too big in our minds? I mean, how influential is this person?
I would say Richard Spencer is less influential now than he was for sort of a brief moment in time. I think that he's obviously more influential in this current political moment than he would be otherwise. But I do think that on a couple different levels, he's sort of not necessarily lost influence, but first of all, there's the question of how many people really are alt-right. How big of a movement is it really? Like, we don't actually have sort of numbers. I mean, I would argue that that doesn't mean that it's not influential. I think that the fact that we're speaking about them right now is proof that they've had a really considerable influence on our politics and on our political culture. I mean, another sort of thing that has happened within the alt-right that I'm sure Graham sort of heard about while he was reporting his story on Richard Spencer was there's been a lot of infighting and a lot of a sort of battle for the soul of the movement and sort of who speaks for it, and there's been kind of splinter movements, and now some people don't want to call themselves alt-right anymore, like Mike Cernovich, for example. And so I would say that Richard's approach, this sort of more highfalutin, sort of more intellectual sort of character that he has presented to the world it's gone out of style a little bit in terms of this kind of new right emerging in favor of the kind of Mike Cernovich types who are a little bit more in your face.
Explain who Mike Cernovich is.
Mike Cernovich is a sort of blogger and Twitter personality who used to call himself alt-right, no longer does, and represents, I think, sort of kind of a splinter movement off of the alt-right that we're sort of seeing emerge.
So two related questions. One is, what role, if any, and I'll emphasize if any, because I want to be fair here, if any, did the alt-right play in the rise in popularity of Donald Trump? And the second question that goes to Spencer directly is he seems to have broken with Donald Trump. What's the cause of that? But go to this key question, because I want to calibrate this exactly to be fair to everyone involved. Did the alt-right have any influence at all in popularizing some of the less politically correct, quote unquote, ideas of Donald Trump?
I mean, I don't think that you can really quantify the extent to which the alt-right helped get Donald Trump elected or popularized him himself. I mean, you do have to take into account that he was already sort of ultra famous before they came along, and there were a number of different factors that led to this. But
he was adopted by this movement.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I think that you could sort of argue the reverse. I think it's sort of Trump himself that gave them a certain political salience that they didn't have before. And I also think that it's important not to conflate the alt-right with sort of the Trump base, which is the real engine of how he got elected.
Right.
I think the alt-right is sort of a very self-consciously kind of ideological movement, and it's also sort of diffuse and mostly based online. And I think that makes it really difficult to say what exactly their impact was in terms of Trump's actual election. I mean, in terms of changing sort of our political culture and how we talk about politics and sort of moving the Overton window, I think that's where they really had impact.
Explain what the Overton window is, just in case somebody doesn't know.
Sort of moving the boundaries of what is sort of considered acceptable and normal speech.
Right. Any sense of why Richard Spencer and parts of the alt-right are breaking with Donald Trump?
I think the most important precipitating event for that break is Trump's or our strike against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Trump, for Richard Spencer, I think, and for much of the alt-right, Trump was not alt-right. Trump was simply someone who would openly raise some of the issues that the alt-right thought were its pet issues. One of the things that Spencer seems very, very strongly thinks very strongly about is heroicization of Vladimir Putin. So anything that suggests that there's a break between Trump and Russia, or anything that suggests that Trump is going soft on issues relating to immigration into the United States, those are things that are Spencer will happily open hostilities with the Trump administration over either of those things.
Can either of you explain the popularity of Vladimir Putin among far-right figures in the United States?
Well, I think there's a couple. It's on sort of a couple different levels. I mean, one is this kind of valorization of white masculinity, and this idea of sort of this sort of strong white European leader acting as sort of a counterbalance to other sort of political forces.
So he's the premier Christian soldier in the northern belt of countries, in other words, Putin.
Right, it's sort of a cult of personality kind of situation. I mean, Graham might also be able to.
Yeah, I think you hit on something that's probably the most important single factor, which is a white alpha male kind of personality that many alt-right figures seem to want to latch onto. There's also a family reason. Richard Spencer is married to a semi-pro propagandist for Vladimir Putin. That is, that's a strong family
What
tie.
makes you a semi-pro propagandist as opposed to a fully professional?
I don't know. She hasn't been raised up from the
part-time.
minors at this point.
It's a part-time job. So the question then becomes that feeling about Putin in the alt-right. Does that feeling in any way explain feelings that some people in the White House might have for Vladimir Putin? Is there any kind of relationship between that?
Well, I think it's clear that Trump himself has, something of an affinity for Vladimir Putin.
But is that based on the fact that he's a symbol of white male Christian masculinity, or is that because Vladimir Putin said something nice about him once? Or is that because of some... No, that's one of the theories, obviously, is that if you say something nice about Donald Trump, he'll like you. But is there any proof that there's this kind of romantic understanding of Putin inside the White House itself? I'm not talking about in the legions of people outside the White House who valorize Putin.
In terms of Trump, I mean, he's shown, a sort of, a considerable record of showing this kind of affinity for, authoritarian leaders, basically, and Putin's not the only one. I would have to sort of see inside his head to see whether there's the same kind of sentiment that I was describing before.
Right.
But I do think that, it fits into Trump's sort of the way that he thinks about these, semi-dictators around the world. He's said very nice things about several of them. And in terms of geopolitics, obviously Donald Trump has not shown a great level of interest in kind of the transatlantic alliance and in keeping sort of Europe together. And I think that that also explains part of his sort of tolerance for Putin.
Yeah. Graeme, is there some sort of direct or indirect connection? Is there some sort of philosophical through line connecting some of the figures on the far right, and some of the figures who actually work in the White House right now on this question?
There are social connections. So Richard Spencer, after he went to the University of Chicago, was at Duke University for a PhD, still unfinished in intellectual history. He came to know Stephen Miller.
You can't help but ride down that guy's academic credentials. You've been doing this for like 30 years.
Stephen Miller is very happy to distance himself from Spencer, but Spencer, I think he does whatever he can to sort of be like a reputational lamprey on those who have actually entered the White House, and to try to take some of their power for himself.
Do you, if you had to name someone in the White House or in the let's say one or two concentric circles out from the White House, who most closely resembles the ideology we're talking about, just sort of their proclivity for this ideology? Would it be Miller? Would it be, where do you come down on that question?
Well, while being very careful not to conflate things that shouldn't necessarily be conflated, Stephen Miller is sort of the one that springs to mind in terms of being kind of a sort of hardcore nationalist, and like Graham said, there is that connection from Duke. Although I don't think that they were close per se, but there
Do they know that he's Jewish?
Do they know that Stephen Miller is Jewish?
Yeah.
I haven't heard any different.
I guess they do now.
Yeah. So yeah. Stephen Miller, I think, has been espousing some pretty hard right ideas for much of his young life. And then if you're sort of talking about these factions within the White House and which one sort of mostly kind of resembles what we're talking about here, you would sort of lump Steve Bannon in among them. I do think that this all sort of oversimplifies it, but if that's...
Right. I think Steve Bannon's definitely the person who many figures in the alt-right would say that this is our guy. The more influence that Steve Bannon has, the more influence that we have. But with someone like Richard Spencer, that there's also, he has a theory of the case of how these ideas are going to enter the mainstream. And it's not that Steve Bannon is alt-right. It's not that Donald Trump is alt-right. It's that these are figures who are making certain discussions possible that through
It's
something
the Overton
as,
window. It's the shift.
It's using something as ambiguous as a tweet, something that can be read in many different ways, and some of those ways are alt-right compliant. Richard Spencer, he knows that if it's so much as discovered that Stephen Miller has had a phone call with him, then Stephen Miller will probably be fired. However, Richard once said about Donald Trump, he said, "I'll always be grateful to Donald Trump because even if he loses the election, even if his presidency is a failure, he's the one who has allowed us to talk about issues that the alt-right cares about. Issues like the identity of America as a white Christian entity. And issues like the criminal cabals that have run this country for the last 20 years, which he thinks, someday when the United States is a better place, they'll be thrown in jail." He says Donald Trump's away there, but he is not himself, on board.
Do a quick continuum, if you could, of the right today, because I want to get to this question of populism rather than nationalism, because I want to make sure that we don't conflate two things that might be different. But do a continuum of the right. You can start with the Heritage Foundation and move to the right, or wherever you want to start. No, I mean, I'm just there's the right the right that we in Washington recognize, and then there are things that we no longer recognize. And fold into that, and you're an expert on this as well, fold into that where the Alex Jones wing of American thought falls onto this continuum, or if that's a total sort of odd appendage.
I think this is
I mean,
really
its paranoia is recognizable, obviously.
Yes, and the paranoia is sprinkled in many different portions of this spectrum. This is difficult to do because it's not a single dimension we're talking about anymore. With the alt-right, I think what we have to, especially the Spencerian alt-right, what we first have to distinguish is people who think that the central organizing political identity should be that of a race, that of white Christians in the case of Richard Spencer. And then all those other conservatives, including neoconservatives, including Reaganites, who they think maybe identity matters a bit, but it matters much more that GDP rises, that the next recession is averted, or that a kind of international order led by an American hegemony is what we need in the world. These are all ideas that are anathema to the Spencerian alt-right because, according to them, it causes this truth about what we deeply are as white Christians to be kind of stamped down and forgotten.
Right. But go back to this question of populism and nationalism. I'm going to ask you for your opinion on this. Are there acceptable expressions in American politics today of populist or nationalist feelings? I mean, are we lumping people who should not be lumped in with Nazis unfairly?
Yeah, so the view of American identity as white Christian is a rather narrow view of what American identity is. That doesn't mean there isn't some view of what American identity is that most people in this room would accept. And it just happens to be one that if you have any decency, will include people of many different colors and religions and so forth. So I think that there may be people who a Spencerian alt-right is trying to pull closer to them, that think of the American identity as something narrower than what, say, Barack Obama might prefer, but isn't quite to the point where it's defining people by their religion or their race.
Right. Rosie, we're going to take some questions fairly soon, but talk about the international dimension of this. How much interplay is there between the right wing here and their counterparts across Europe, and Was I right or wrong before to suggest that maybe, at least in France, this bubble is bursting, this kind of fever is bursting, and that we're not going to see a wave of nationalism sweep across countries that previously had unalloyed reputations as open democracies?
Well, to take the first part of your question, I mean, first it depends like which part of the right you're talking about. If you're talking about the sort of Bannonite right, there's definitely been there have been overtures that have been made. You know, Steve Bannon has spoken highly of some of these figures in the European far right.
Who has he spoken of positively?
Well, for example, the Le Pen niece. She's a very popular character actually on the American alt-right. And so, and Breitbart has written about that.
She's a smoother version of her aunt, who's a smoother version of her father. Is that fair?
Well, yeah, I guess if you're sort of going to go down through the generations that way, that's a sort of, yeah. In terms of what this means for the future of populism in Europe, I mean, you know, I and many others kind of saw Donald Trump's election as him sort of like leading this global sort of populist nationalist wave. In the intervening months, it seemed like it's not as much of a sort of upward movement as we may have thought. I would argue that it's not necessarily that a fever is broken, and it's more so that this type of ideology has become kind of baked in the cake in certain places. It's not necessarily a growth trajectory anymore, but it's just sort of part of the political firmament. So
that's the interesting question, right there, is even if these parties don't win across Europe, for instance, or other places, are there ideas now in the discourse in a way that they weren't 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The way that the alt-right likes to speak of this introduction of ideas is the term red pilling. And I don't know how many red pilling, to take the red pill, like in the movie The Matrix.
The Matrix, blue pill, red pill.
You take the pill and then you realize that you've been enslaved for all these years mentally, and that actually there are aliens who are taking over your mind. You take the pill and then you realize who you really are. What I think the alt-right thinks is that this wave of nationalist victories, or near victories, is a kind of collective red pilling, where people, whether or not these particular political movements succeed, they're waking up slightly, and they're thinking of, in terms of identity, in a way that they had been taught as dogma in schools, in politics. It's forbidden to speak about identity in these ways, and now it's impossible not to think of identity in these ways. With Richard in particular, though, he has, I think, the most ambitious and expansive view of what that red pilling can lead to, where instead of thinking of yourself as a patriotic Frenchman or German or Austrian, maybe we could start thinking of ourselves as patriotic white people, white Christians.
As a unified white race spanning the ocean.
In a way that we've never thought of before.
Okay, that's going to be a hard sell for a lot of people, I think. But what's, I'm trying for understatement. But there's a related question, Rosie, and maybe you could go at this one. What percentage of the people who, this would be your opinion based on reporting.
Well, I don't have opinions.
No, I know you don't have opinions. I told her not to have opinions. Now she's not going to have an opinion. Based on reporting, based on polls, based on anecdotal evidence, what percentage of people who vote for Trump or make up that hardcore base of support that's keeping him in office, that keeps Republicans in Congress in line, what percentage of that is part of what might think of as a conscious, almost conscious white backlash against the change that is occurring in America?
Well, I think the question is how conscious is it? I mean, I don't think that most people think of themselves in sort of ideological terms, the way that the sort of thought leaders of the Trump movement do. I think that if you look at what happened in this past election, I think it is clear that it was driven by this sort of popular unrest among the white working class that felt that it had been left behind in certain ways. And there was this whole question that became almost like a Twitter meme of economic anxiety, and like how much is it driven by economic anxiety and how much is it driven by sort of cultural or racial anxiety. And I think that it's actually sort of, it's all of those things. For some people it was just one of those things, and for some people it was a combination thereof. I mean, you can't really quantify it, but there definitely was a sort of cultural backlash among kind of, forgotten whites in this country that was a driving factor in him being elected.
Right. And how many of those do you think are red-pilled in a way?
I think very few. Many times when reporting on Richard, I've thought about things that I've seen with ISIS. ISIS is very, very similar in their ideas of how these ideas penetrate. With ISIS, they don't believe that most Muslims agree with them, but they believe that there are a few things that they might be able to get people on board with. You ask innocently, do you think that the ideal way to run the world is as a caliphate, with a really good caliph? And then you get ordinary people to say, well, yeah, theoretically, yes. Similarly, with the alt-right, you'd ask, well, do you think that just anyone can be an American with any views at all? And they say, well, no, there's some limits, of course. And then you add, well, maybe are some of those limits racial, or some of them religious? So what there is in both cases is an understanding that there's a kind of lumpen electorate or base that can be brought along with just a few thought leaders getting those ideas penetrated in.
So go to this final question, and if you want to start lining up at mics, please do, and we'll try to get people up there as well. But go to this last question. You mentioned ISIS. Graeme, of course, is one of the world's great experts on not only ISIS ideology, but on the radicalization process. We've seen at the margins some violence, what you might call white backlash violence in this country periodically. Richard Spencer, on the other hand, is most famous for getting punched rather than punching. Do you expect, and it's a question we can end on this question, do you expect a radicalization process to continue in certain segments of the white American community? Do you think that this is going to lead to a systematic violence of the sort that we saw in the 80s with the Order and various other neo-Nazi groups?
I think it's possible. Now, with the comparison I made with ISIS, I think, as you say, Richard famous for getting punched,
right.
And his idea, ISIS's idea of people it doesn't like is kill them or enslave them. With Richard, it's through a series of policies make them voluntarily leave this country, which
right.
is preferable at least to the ISIS version.
Right.
But it's certainly true that the ideas that Richard has are ideas that are closely associated with violence eventually. And I would be shocked if we didn't see at least some more of that. And none of that, by the way, is to absolve the violence we've already seen at the hands of the alt-right, but it could get worse.
Rosie?
Well, I think, the sort of alt-right as a movement, however you want to define it, I think that if we were going to see, sort of full-scale organized violence on their part, I suspect we would have sort of seen it already. They're very disorganized as a group of people. I do agree full-heartedly with Graeme that the types of ideas that Richard espouses, that they have undergirded movements that have led to violence. And so you can't really rule anything out. But the idea that there are sort of going to be, hordes of young guys in, Make America Great Again hats and Pepe the Frog signs, carrying out sort of violent raids or anything. I would hesitate before I'd say that. We see this kind of gang-ish behavior
at these Confederate these rallies against taking down Confederate statues, but they haven't, and certainly in Berkeley and places we've seen some kind of confrontation, but I'm asking about terrorism. You don't see that developing?
I can't rule anything out, and of course there have been instances of like neo-Nazi terror in this country before.
Right.
But I really, I don't know.
We'll go here and then there. Go ahead. And please keep your questions in the form of a question. Because because I'll be ruthless.
Hi,
Not there's any pressure on you now.
no, mine's a question. Hi, my name's Yuma, and my question is, in your experience on the field and in your professional lives, have you seen any types of trends or patterns in the response to this alt-right populism, nationalism movement among the left, among the establishment and the globalists, etc.?
What do you mean by response exactly? Do you mean
Like, is the response to kind of look at it and think, oh, we should engage and intellectually debate, or we should ostracize it and not allow it to be in the open? Stuff like that.
I mean, in my experience, sort of reporting on the alt-right, I think there have been sort of different phases. At first, it was, why are you writing about these people? This is like 10 guys in their mom's basement. Then it was like, oh my God, this is so scary. Like, please keep reporting on it. And then sort of another wave of backlash of okay, now you've given them too much attention. So it's gone in kind of a cycle like that. And I think, like I was saying before, I think now, I do think that this movement and sort of related movements have become kind of sort of a feature of our politics that doesn't really seem to be going anywhere.
I think one pattern I've seen is a kind of unfair denial of some of the ideas of the alt-right. There was a period of understandable disgust for this movement, which led, much like the disgust that we all had for ISIS, to look at the alt-right as something that didn't have an intellectual genealogy, didn't have journals that were devoted to its ideas. And as with ISIS, we're now getting to a point where we're understanding that those ideas have had places in American history, have had places in American politics. And I think that's probably a good step toward understanding them and eventually, getting rid of them.
Is this on? Yeah. My question is about the larger picture with the Republican Party. Donald Trump being the leader of the party and everything. How Trumpy do you think the GOP will be in like 10 or 15 years? Because I think the GOP has turned largely into a party organized around the principle of defending the position of whites in the country and embracing Donald Trump the way that it has. Paul Ryan saying that Donald Trump said a racist statement about that judge and then voting for him, and pumping for him and everything. So the GOP has capitulated to this guy. And what are the long-term consequences of that for the GOP and for the country?
Well, I think that a lot of this is going to depend on how well his presidency goes, whether he manages to win re-election, and a whole host of other sort of electoral factors. We're still very early on in this administration, and anything could really happen over the next couple years. I mean, I think that you're right that the Republicans have largely sort of fallen in line, and like Jeff was saying earlier, part of that is because his numbers among Republican voters are actually still pretty good. His power sort of derives from his base. And I think when you start seeing that change is when you might see Republican leadership starting to kind of back away from him a little bit, and then you could see sort of a culture shift in terms of what the party sort of is willing to tolerate or not. But these are all sort of hypotheticals.
Today in the news, we've seen Britain open talks to leave the EU, leave running on a very anti-immigration platform. We've seen Eastern European countries say that they would rather incur sanctions from the EU rather than let in more migrants. We've seen Turkey saying that they're probably going to dishonor, indications from Turkey, they're probably going to dishonor a deal to keep Syrian migrants within Turkey. So we've really seen...
So what's the question?
The question is, we've really seen a global kind of backlash against immigration and migration in the past couple of years. Are we really just looking at a kind of interesting looking tree in a deep forest of anti-immigration backlash that is kind of outside outside of the major parties and what they find acceptable?
Right. I mean, Graham, is globalism versus localism, which is what we're talking about in a way, is this mainly about immigration and the people that you've come to know?
I think immigration is a very important idea for them. It's definitely it's one of the issues that gets them out of bed in the morning. Now, it's also something that is used for something larger. Like, as I've said many times tonight, the idea of a state, of an ethno-state, as Spencer likes to say, is something more than curtailing immigration. It's that plus making the state reflect in its policies a new idea of what it is. So I think it's a very important factor, but it's not the end game for any of the alt-right who I've spoken to.
Hi. I was actually wondering about gender in the alt-right, because obviously the movement is focused around white male leaders, but I've also noticed that within the movement there are white females who subscribe to the ideas. And I was kind of wondering what you think they feel there is to gain from subscribing to that and how they join that movement.
I'd say, first of all, white women are no less interested in being edgy and hip and all the things that the alt-right claims to be than white men. So that's part of it. There's also, though, I think it needs to be mentioned, a natalist aspect of the alt-right. So they want lots of alt-right kids. They want lots of white Christian babies. This is very important to them. And I think a lot of the iconography of women in the movement is closely tied to that.
I'm sorry, how much of that is directly derived from good old-fashioned Nazi propaganda about fecund white women?
Yeah, I mean, it looks just like that. If you went to the National Policy Institute, which is kind of astroturfed think tank that Richard runs, a lot of the propaganda would, it has those bright yellow hair kind of images of Central European fecundity.
Thanks, go ahead. Central European fecundity.
You didn't expect me to say
No,
that.
no, no, no. Not a word combination I was expecting tonight. Go ahead.
I don't know if I can exactly...
Could you step closer to the mic?
Yeah, I don't know if I can exactly put this in the form of a question, but I mean, one major critique of this discussion, of your article and everything, is that it seems to kind of cop to Richard Spencer's terms that he lays out, which is that culture is the thing that is, that politics is downstream from culture. That culture is what's driving everything. When in the last 30 or 40 years, the economy has undoubtedly completely changed structurally and in every way to the detriment of most people. Like, is this not the thing that is probably behind this? I mean, Spencer being rich and being a leader of this movement, there are always rich and well-educated leaders of lots of social movements.
Okay,
Isn't
Graham, you want
economic
to go with that?
decline and pain for people causing probably more than cultural change?
Yeah, I mean, often people will point to economic, wage stagnation among white people and so forth. And I'm not going to say that's not important. It's often assumed, though, because of the power of that kind of materialist explanation, that is where this is going. That's the end. When I think it's both the end and the means. Richard and his ilk are very happy to pick up the dissatisfaction from wage stagnation or what have you, and then move that toward an end that has nothing to do with economics at all. So I don't think we need to choose one or the other. They're both going to be very important.
But isn't that the only way
I'm going to go to these other
respond
questions.
It, though, is to say this is what the real issue is, that these people are
Okay,
lying
thank
to
you.
that
I'm going to go to the
economics
question over here. Thanks. Go ahead.
Hi. So my question has two parts. Oh, not. It's two parts.
Talk into the mic.
2 parts, one question. One is that do you guys think that we're having a multi-speed economy where one part of the country might be still upset that they lost their coal jobs 30 years ago, and the other is moving on to solar energy, and that causes just economic backlash? And also, how does the ideas that are voiced in books like The Decline of Western Liberalism by Edward Luce play into kind of this fringe alt-right element that's becoming less fringe?
I think the first one you dealt with in the previous answer.
I mean, I would just say the more I look at this movement and other movements that are have been afflicting us for the last couple of years, the more I see that the power of ideas is not to be underestimated. I mean, Richard and I, we almost literally come from exactly the same geographic and economic milieu, from a prosperous North Dallas families with physicians, physician fathers, and we have different ideas because of different ideas that reached us at different moments. And we could say that this is a kind of high echelon thought leader type phenomenon, but I think it's replicated in many, many different places where it matters a lot where the ideas come from, and less than you might think some of the material and economic explanations.
Go ahead. Thanks.
So my question also has to do with gender in the alt-right. Since, as I'm sure everyone knows, the term red pilling did originate in a hyper-misogynistic corner of the internet, I wonder how much of particularly young men joining the alt-right has to do with the male backlash in addition to a white backlash, or a combination of male and white backlash.
So I do think that there is a certain amount of overlap between sort of the alt-right and the kind of men's rights movement, which is what you're referring to. I don't think that they're necessarily the same thing. I do think that like they're in the Venn diagram there is overlap. In terms of it being about sort of male backlash, it's hard to say. I will say that, you know, in my experience reporting on the alt-right, I have found that it is a very heavily male movement, especially, you know, young men. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but there is sort of an element to it of kind of valorizing like white masculinity and stuff like that.
Are there any questions up there? I mean, you could shout them if somebody wanted to raise their hand. I don't want to discriminate. Yeah, just go shout. Did you understand? I heard it.
He's
very well.
asking about whether martial law is going to be declared by people in the Trump administration.
Is that?
I think, yeah.
Well, you know, it certainly hasn't happened yet.
Well, you're sitting in one of the first places to go, by the way. We've gathered you here for a reason.
Right. I think that it's important to sort of, you know, keep a clear head in terms of what's really going on here. I think that one of the unfortunate sort of political after effects of Trump's election has been that there is a certain level of kind of fear and paranoia among the opposition that sometimes becomes a little bit outside the realm of what is sort of, you know, could really happen in reality. So in terms of, I mean, I think that, you know, democracy is a fragile thing and anything could always happen, but I don't really see any evidence that we're about to enter into a martial law situation.
I would just say we have not seen yet the courts lose their power or lose their enforcement power, and so I don't want anybody to leave here thinking that we're certainly overstating any kind of threat to the democracy that we have. I mean, that down the road,
so far our democratic institutions have basically held up, actually.
Right.
So
I'm going to do two more questions. I'm sorry to everyone else, but we're going to run out of time very quickly. So you and then you, or you and you. Either one. Go ahead. My apologies.
This might have already been answered, so if it has, go ahead and skip it. There's been an alarming increase in diagnosis of anxiety, depression, suicides, and overdose in the past decade. More Americans ever are feeling dissociated and isolated from their communities.
We can't hear you.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Slower.
Okay. Since this is already answered before, go ahead and skip it. There's been an alarming increase in diagnoses of anxiety, depression, suicides, and overdose deaths in the past decade. More Americans than ever are feeling disconnected and isolated from their communities. How much does this play a role in people subscribing to far-right ideologies?
So if I understood the question properly, that there's a sense of isolation, there are suicides, overdoses that are happening, and how much does this play a role in the rise of far-right ideologies? Yes. Is that right? Again, I'll go back to lean a bit on some ISIS reporting. There are many people who, in normal circumstances, would not be reaching very far for the ideas that they're going to pick up. And then in extremists, they are willing to look a bit further, especially if they feel like they are rejected, especially if they feel like they haven't been heard. And if there is a kind of anomie that comes from whatever is associated with these overdoses and suicides, then I wouldn't be terribly surprised if a similar phenomenon happened and people were feeling like they were rejected from normal channels of political expression and then trying something different.
I want to just add something to that, because the economist Tyler Cowen has an interesting theory about why, and he's arguing that there won't be a revolution in America, whatever kind of revolution you can imagine. And he says that we as a country, we supply sufficient amounts of cheap calories to our citizenry, and sufficient amount of entertainment options, video games and the like. So people are actually narcotized into a kind of quiescence about their condition. I would add to that a third, which is the narcotization that comes from actual narcotics, and the opioid epidemic being a case in point. So I would attach myself to Graham's basic analysis, and this has been his analysis not only of the alt-right in America, but of ISIS, of course, that the trigger, the accelerant to these kind of problems are smart people with sets of easily articulated, coherent ideas, a coherent worldview. I think without that, you don't have the phenomenon that we might be seeing today. You have to have, it has to start with this set of ideas. Economic distress alone is not going to turn someone into a Nazi. There has to be a Nazi right nearby, or easy access to a worldview in order to make that happen. Go ahead.
All right, thanks for taking my question. And I got a quick second here. You and John Lovett were great on the pod last week, so I just got to say that. But
oh my God, that was a high wire act for me, I got to say.
I thought you were fantastic.
All right.
But hopeful question to end this here. You talk about kind of a backlash in Western Europe. There's been a lot more moderate and left kind of awakening. Do you see a side effect of an unintended consequence of the Trump administration being kind of an awakening of the left and, more importantly, the moderates in the center as kind of a new force that's going to awaken in Western Europe and possibly the United States?
Well, I don't think there's any question that that the Democratic base has been very energized by this. And if you look at the special election, for example, in Georgia's 6th district, and the fact that John Ossoff, has done so well, that's sort of evidence of that. I don't know. I mean, a lot of this we'll be able to have more answers after the midterms happen in 2018 to see actually how sort of codified and organized this backlash is going to be.
Great.
At least in America, I mean, in terms of.
So yes, we've seen some signals of a backlash. What I don't think we've seen, though, is the same spryness in the field of ideas. The alt-right has kind of energized different nationalist movements, and there is this kind of pan-white vision that's out there. And these are, the creation of identity is something that has happened before. And it's not as if the creation of German identity or Italian identity or French identity in the 19th century has been undone. Those ideas are still around. Now, the difficulty is we now see different identities being formed, this pan-white identity that's aspirationally at least being formed. And the left in the early 20th century found, the birth of a kind of modern liberal democracy as a way to combat that then. And that felt like a new thing. That felt like something new and important. Now, the backlash that we have right now and the reaction to the alt-right, I don't think is as exciting, is not as new, and it's not quite ready to acknowledge the ideas that the alt-right has brought with it. So, although we see, electoral victories here and there, I think there's actually still a lot to come in the field of ideas that we still need to observe from the left as a reaction.
We're going to do one more question because you've been standing there, and I feel bad.
Thank you. Hi.
Make it a quick question.
Very quick. My name is Soraya. I'm an anxious liberal arts student who wants to know how to have a dialogue with an alt-right person without rolling my eyes.
How do you have a conversation with someone on the alt-right? They want to have a conversation with you. I mean,
have you heard of this thing called Twitter? Because you can have that conversation all night long.
No, I actually have. There was a grad student who's very similar to Richard Spencer, very similar views, had all these conspiracy theories, had taken the red pill, and I had been in conversation with him, and we had to end it because it got to the point where it was that violent in demeanor. And I've been trying to, and I don't know how to respond to things of that level of violence. But there is also an evident
psychoanalytic aspect to it. There's all the things you talked about, all the anxiety. I just don't know how to balance my empathy with, you know, an intellectual like dialogue. Have you had that block, or have you accomplished that?
Yeah,
Right.
so
Well, can you answer this in the context of de-radicalization of ISIS? I'm not comparing blah 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 blah, but do that.
Yeah, well, I have some very pessimistic things to say about that.
Oh, good.
You can have these conversations. It doesn't mean that it ends with the other person being convinced. But having the conversations is itself, I think, something we should aspire to do. It's important with the alt-right, however, and with ISIS too, to distinguish between real conversations and then what's on their side simply trolling. That's what you probably get if you just reach out to the next person you find online who identifies himself as alt-right. So with talking to Richard Spencer or talking to someone from ISIS, you want to instead get to the point where you're actually understanding what these ideas are. And having the person interact with you, at least acknowledging your humanity, the fact that you are trying to understand. And you know, that's the only way you get to the point where there might be at least some intellectual back and forth that plants a seed of doubt in the other person. You know, in the case of ISIS, you find many people who, the reaction that they have when hearing someone say that ISIS is the way to be a Muslim is to simply dismiss them hatefully, you know, to mock them. It seems to be the only way that interaction actually gets anywhere is to plant at least a bit of doubt there. And once the worm gets in the apple, it might bring the rottenness that leads to a different idea in that person. But without at least starting that conversation, you're not going to get anywhere at all. So try it.
Let me close with this question for Rosie. It's related to this, and this is very important. Do you see any evidence that people in the Trump administration, not alt-right people, because we don't alt-right people in the Trump administration, but people who subscribe to a more populist, nationalist understanding of America and its challenges at the moment, do you see over the last 5 or 6 months any proof that coming into contact with the reality of governance, the executive order on immigration, for instance, do you think that anything has happened to make them say, you know what, these ideas are great in theory, but in the American framework, they just can't be carried out? Or do you still see a kind of a level of true believer on the part of people who went into this administration?
I mean, I don't see any evidence that the sort of White House ideologues have changed their ideology. I do think that, like you said, the fact that it's now bumped up against the realities of governing means that we're not seeing sort of like a full-fledged, like Steve Bannon's entire agenda is not being enacted right now because it's been sort of impossible. The travel ban has not been able to make it through the legal system. There have been certain victories. I mean, there was, you know, Trump's sort of refusal to commit to Article 5 at the NATO summit. There have been certain things that were sort of on the agenda that are being carried out. But I do think that it's not a question of ideology changing. I think it's a question of things that were wanted bumping up against things that sort of either have to happen or are getting in the way.
Got it. My apologies to everyone who wanted to ask a question and couldn't, but I appreciate all of you being here tonight. The Atlantic thanks you, and I thank Rosie and Graham for a great conversation. Thank you very much for coming.